Hello, everybody. Happy to see that you all of us joined us. I would like to welcome you at our webinar, the Climate Smart PIIRS Indicators. The person who is going to present the webinar is Pierre Bannery, energy specialist and consultant. And first of all, he is going to explain you information how you can fill in the PIIRS, climate smart indicators, and after there will be a space for questions. And at the same moment here, I am Martina Luskova. I am a monitoring and evaluation specialist for CCRP. And I have here as well my colleague, Julie Capel, who is climate smart officer from CCRP.
Okay, yes. Hello, everyone. So yes, I'd like to welcome you to this Climate Change and Resilience Platform webinar, today, August 22nd, 2019, presented by me, Pierre Bannery, and I'll be taking you through the CARE Climate Smart PIIRS indicators. So this webinar's main goal is to explain how to enter data into these new PIIRS indicators, as well as provide recommendations to new processes to help collect the required data. So in this presentation, there's a bit of overview of the content here. We'll take you through first some background and context. Secondly, going through the PIIRS Climate Smart indicators in a step-by-step fashion. Finally, ending with some recommendations. So a bit of background and context. Well, currently, international as well as national plans to reduce emissions are wholly inadequate to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and may lead the world to a highly dangerous 3 degrees Celsius warming this century. The last 4 years were the 4 hottest on record, and winter temperatures in the Arctic have risen by 3 degrees Celsius since 1990. We are starting to see the life-threatening impacts of climate change on health through air pollution, heat waves, and risks to food security. The impacts of climate change have a devastating impact on the poorest and most vulnerable, undermining food and nutrition security and contributing to increased humanitarian emergencies. Now, the burden of these impacts falls disproportionately on women and girls and would likely increase existing inequalities and vulnerabilities between men and women. Therefore, a tremendous level of effort is needed to stay within a global temperature increase of 1.5 degrees and to support the poorest to adapt to the adverse effects of the climate emergency. Now, CARE is already working on the ground to support communities, particularly women, in their adaptation to the effects of climate change and is calling on governments to take responsibility and increase action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and support adaptation efforts of the poorest countries. Our organization has received donations for climate change-related work. In fact, Greta Thunberg recently awarded us with a share of a prize she received in acknowledgement of our strong work on climate justice. But CARE must continue in this direction and walk the talk regarding its greenhouse gas emissions and overall contributions to climate impact. This is why we have the new climate smart indicators. They will allow us to, firstly, have an annual global overview of the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions generated by CARE, as well as to have a global overview of the total amount of greenhouse gas emission reductions by CARE over consecutive years, to have a global overview on the types of measures developed by CARE offices to reduce and/or offset emissions, as well as generate information that supports reflection and learning around good practices to reduce emissions, and about areas that require improvement and support. Now, all data will be retrieved and analyzed, and results will be shared with all CARE offices in an annual report. Lastly, we'd like to inform you that CARE country offices are not obligated to fill in this PIIRS data this year. We, of course, strongly encourage you to report on your carbon emissions, but if you realize the process is impossible due to lack of previously collected data, we advise you to take it as an opportunity to create and initiate the data collection systems and be prepared for data collection in fiscal year 2020. So moving on to a quick overview of the new Climate Smart PIIRS section. 4 elements constitute this new PIIRS section. So we'll be looking into the flights and greenhouse gas emissions during the fiscal year, the fuel consumption for vehicle use during the fiscal year, the office energy consumption during the fiscal year, as well as the measures your office has taken to reduce and/or offset emissions in the fiscal year. So to show you what the PIIRS document looks like, we will now move quickly out of the presentation and to the PIIRS document. So if you know the PIIRS document well, 2 minutes, this is what it looks like, and you'll find a new section at the bottom under section 6, CARES Carbon Footprint and Climate Smart Practices. This section is also accompanied by a full legend situated on the right, which will help you in the filling in of the data entry points. Now coming back to our presentation and zooming in on this new section, we see that we have 4 clear parts here in this new PIIRS section. Step 1 will look into the flights and greenhouse gas emissions during the fiscal year. Step 2 will be the fuel consumption for the vehicle use during the fiscal year. Step 3, the office energy consumption. And step 4, the measures taken to reduce and/or offset the greenhouse gas emissions during the fiscal year. Of course, with this, there's a guidance note that has been produced, the CARE Carbon Footprint and Climate Smart Practices in PIIRS. The guidance note, this material is available at the hyperlink displayed here, in which this presentation will be shared with you all, so you have access to it. So, looking at the PIIRS Climate Smart indicators in a step-by-step process, well, the process itself. So firstly, what you'll have to do before filling in this data will be review the Climate Smart guidance note. Then you will have to gather all available data and documents. Now, gathering the data will in most cases mean retrieving specific data from the certain department of your office, such as, for example, with vehicle fuel expenses for the vehicle fuel use, that will usually be from the financial department of your office. Now, duration-wise, this may be a lengthy process if you are doing it for the first time. However, once a base is built and it performed regularly, it will significantly reduce the amount of time spent filling in the data. After gathering the data, you will have to process the data and the documents. You'll have to go through PIIRS and fill in the required data. And finally, you'll be able to share and discuss it with relevant team members or partners in the office. So here we'll dive in directly into each and every category. So step 1 are the flights and greenhouse gas emissions during the fiscal year. In this section, it is important to report the number of flights paid for by your office for both staff and consultants. Each CARE office is asked to report on the gathered information of all its different offices in the country. For example, CARE USA will report on the emissions related to its Atlanta headquarters and all the sub-offices in the USA, but will not report on the emissions of the country offices it leads in the global south, such as CARE Uganda will report on the emissions of its national office in Kampala and all its sub-offices in Uganda. Here are the first entry points for this section. So step 1.1, these are the number of flights and hours of flying. So here we'll be looking into the number of flights under or equal to 2 hours of flight time, the number of flights over 2 hours of flight time, the total number of flights during the fiscal year, which will be calculated automatically in the PIIRS sheet when you input the 2 previous entries, and finally, the total number of hours of all flights during the fiscal year. But attention, so when reporting flights that have intermediate stops, consider them as one flight and include the total hours of flying. For example, if you had a travel that consists of a 1-hour-long flight, an intermediate stop, and another flight of 6 hours, you should report this as one flight over 2 hours. This should thus not be counted as 2 separate flights, such as one flight under 2 and one over 2 hours of flight time. We then go to the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions from flights that were supported by your office. Here we'll be looking into the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions in tons of CO2 equivalent from flights that were supported by your office during the fiscal year, as well as which method or calculator was used for determining the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. That was used to calculate it, basically. Now, you can calculate your office flight emissions yourself with an online tool, or you may ask an external organization to do it for you. The most important thing to keep in mind is to be consistent, so to use the same calculation methodology over the years. Now, if you choose to do the calculation of emissions yourself, CARE recommends to use the online calculator Atmosphere, of which the link is shown here in the gray box on this presentation. Now, this calculator can be found via this link, and we will now show you, coming out of our presentation, what this Atmosphere looks like. So moving on to Atmosphere here, .de, if you follow this site, you will have to go to Offset Flight at the link on the main page. Once having gone to Offset Flight, you're presented to this page. Here we will show you an example. So you can put departure airport as Paris. We'll have an arrival airport as New Delhi, and an intermediate stop. For example, we'll put Dubai Airport. And for each flight, it is important to choose the flight class, the flight type, as well as the aircraft type. So economy, first class, or business, flight type, chartered or scheduled, and aircraft type, here we'll choose the A330 or A300, 310. You have to just keep note of this. And then you choose how many number of flights or the number of persons. Once having filled in this information, you click on Calculate. Atmosphere calculates the flight emissions for you. And here, for example, in this specific example, you find that for this flight, which is a return flight as well, your flight per person generated 3,224 kilograms of CO2 emissions. Now, a recommendation here. Of course, experience has shown that it is preferable to monitor emissions on a continuous basis using a live spreadsheet or database, rather than calculate emissions in one large annual number crunching exercise. Because of course, calculating the greenhouse gas emissions for all your flights at once can be a tough and lengthy task, especially using Atmosphere, where you have to enter specific data for each and every single flight. So it is highly recommended to use this on a live spreadsheet on a regular basis and to fill it out throughout the year. We will now proceed with an example to illustrate how to fill in this data for the flight section. So in this example, let's assume that your office has to report flights and greenhouse gas emissions for fiscal year 2018. Let us assume that your office has taken 200 flights in fiscal year 2018. After processing the data and documents, you may tackle the PIIRS indicators. So you can start by distinguishing between all flights under or equal to 2 hours of flight time and those over 2 hours of flight time. Say we find that 50 flights are under or equal to 2 hours of flight time and 150 flights are over 2 hours of flight time. This data is then input into PIIRS in their respective entry points. You then must calculate the total number of hours of all flights during the fiscal year. So this, for example, would be a flight of 2 hours plus 4.5 hours, 3 hours and 9 hours, and so on, up to another flight of 4 hours. After calculating all this, let's assume that we have an answer of 680 hours of total flight time during the fiscal year. This is then input here into its respective entry point. So now we have a flight and greenhouse gas emissions PIIRS section, which looks like this, presented here on this page. We then have to go and fill in the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions due to flights during the fiscal year. And of course, I remind you that this would have to be done for every single flight, but here we will take an example of flying from Paris to New Delhi via Dubai, both economy flights, scheduled flights on an Airbus A330. This is a round trip from Paris to New Delhi with a stopover in Dubai. So upon using Atmosphere to calculate, it finds that we have 3,406 kilograms of CO2 emissions due to this flight. But notice that this result is in kilograms of CO2 equivalent. To input this data into the PIIRS sheets, it must first be converted into tons of CO2 equivalent. Well, knowing that 1 ton is equal to 1,000 kilograms, thus you must divide Atmosphere's result by 1,000 in order to get a result in tons of CO2 equivalent. So once converted, this example results in 3.406 tons of CO2 equivalent. Once having calculated, you input this into PIIRS, and this is so of course you input this, and we have now 3.406 tons of CO2 equivalent due to this flight, as well as input of which calculator was used, so www.atmosphere.de. But attention, remember, this is just an example. This is specifically just an example for one single flight. In the real-world situation, you would calculate emissions for each flight taken and sum them up to a total, and then enter that total into this PIIRS entry. So the value is likely to be much bigger than this 3.406 tons of CO2. We now move on to the step 2, the fuel consumption for vehicle use in the fiscal year. So this section allows for the estimation of emissions from vehicle use by your office. Note that only vehicles used for professional purposes by your staff and consultants should be considered. Also, this question does not include daily office commuting by your office staff with their personal vehicle. Also, taxis and Ubers are also beyond the scope of this calculation. But we acknowledge that taxis and Ubers may represent a large usage for your office, so you might consider options that could be promoted to help reduce your office emissions related to taxi or Uber usage. It has been chosen that is beyond the scope of this calculation because collecting the required data does not seem feasible at the moment, so it is not included for now. However, it's to be acknowledged that it may represent, as said before, an important share of emissions. Also, and finally, when speaking of vehicles, this means all kinds of transport, besides airplanes, of course, that operate under CARES name. So, looking closely into this PIIRS section. Step 2, we'll be looking into the number of liters of gasoline, diesel, as well as other fuels. So for each entry point, you will have to enter the amount of liters of gasoline consumed during the fiscal year, the amount of liters of diesel, as well as the amount of liters of other fuels. Other fuels can be such as biodiesel, ethanol, liquefied petroleum such as propane or LPG or liquefied petroleum gas, even methane or hydrogen. Now, if you have this data already in liters, you can directly enter the values. If not, you will have to convert your value into liters first. You will most likely have this data in terms of amounts spent on fuel in the fiscal year. So in order to proceed, you will have to divide the amount spent, which likely be in US dollars, in euros, or any local currency, by the average cost of gasoline, diesel, or the other fuel, which would be in currency per liter of that fiscal year. If you have this data, then you must divide the amount spent on fuel by the average cost of fuel to get an amount of fuel consumed in liters, and this is shown here in the orange box, this calculation here. Another recommendation here, of course, is to keep track of all fuel expenses on a regular basis, such as in a regularly input a form, a vehicle usage form. So this would allow also as well to input the actual fuel price when the fuel was purchased instead of using an annual average, and this would allow, of course, to be a bit more precise. Of course, experience has shown that it is preferable to monitor emissions on a continuous basis such as this, and in a live spreadsheet that is updated regularly. An example is shown here, where you have a date where the fuel was purchased, the amount spent, the fuel type, the fuel price at the time of purchase, and so we have a direct knowledge of the fuel amount in liters. We move on now to another example to illustrate the input and calculation as well as input into this PIIRS section. So let's assume your office has 3 vehicles registered under its name. The financial department provides you with the fuel expenses due to vehicle use. We have $500 for fiscal year 2018, of which $300 are for gasoline and $200 are for diesel fuel. We will use the local average price of gasoline and diesel per liter during the fiscal year 2018 in order to calculate the amount in liters that was consumed. Let's assume that $1.4 per liter of gasoline and a price of $1.2 per liter of diesel. Upon calculating, so we divide 300 by 1.4, this gives us 214.29 liters of gasoline, which we input into the section, as well as $200 divided by 1.2, which gives us 166.67 liters of diesel. This data is entered in the respective entry points, and here in this prime example, we have 0 liters of other fuel. We then move on to step 3, Here we'll be looking into the office energy consumption during the fiscal year. This section allows for the estimation of emissions from energy consumption in your office during the fiscal year. This section does not take account of home office working and its eventual energy use. So, moving into step 3.1, taking a closer look. First entry points here are the number of liters of gasoline, diesel, and other fuels consumed by generators to power the office. So this section is specifically for offices that use fuel-powered generators to provide energy to their offices. Similarly to the input for fuel consumption for vehicle use, data input is required for the fuel consumption for generator use. So if you have this data in liters, it can be input directly into PIIRS. Otherwise, it will have to be converted, such as with the vehicle use. But of course, there are a few subtleties here to take account of. If there is a generator for the whole facility where your office is based, and you must thus identify how much of that generator usage corresponds to your office energy needs. So for example, if your office is just one office in a building of multiple offices, you must distinguish how much energy use, well, generator fuel use corresponds to your office. So a way to calculate this is using the calculation shown below, so the following formula. You will have to acknowledge your office surface, which would be in square meters, over the total facility surface in square meters as well. This will be your prime factor in this formula. Once you have this data, you multiply that factor by the total generator fuel consumption of the facility, which should be in liters. And this will give you an answer in generator fuel consumption of your office in liters. We then move to the other part of the office energy consumption during the fiscal year. Here we'll be looking into the amount of kilowatt hours of electricity consumed during the fiscal year, the CO2 intensity of your electricity provider in grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour during the fiscal year, and the amount of cubic meters of gas consumed during the fiscal year. Taking a closer look, firstly into the amount of kilowatt hours of electricity consumed during the fiscal year. Now, the total amount of kilowatt hours used by your office during the fiscal year should be available in the metered electricity consumption or utility bills, specifying consumption in megawatt hours or kilowatt hour units. If this data is in megawatt hours, you must convert it into kilowatt hours by multiplying it by 1,000, since 1 megawatt hour is equal to 1,000 kilowatt hours. Secondly, the CO2 intensity of your electricity provider in grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour during the fiscal year. Now, this data can be available, well, it can be provided directly by your energy provider, which often indicates CO2 intensity information in their electricity bills or on their websites. You may also contact your energy provider for this information. This is shown here, for example, by Electric Ireland in their fuel mix disclosure label. So they show that between January 2013 to December 2013, they had an average of 535 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. Note that in some countries, the term CO2 emission intensity is used, while in other countries, CO2 emission factor is used. We'll have to distinguish between them, knowing that they surely mean the same information. However, if your energy provider cannot give you this information, you may provide us with the CO2 emission factor indicated in your national energy grid. And this following source here is recommended, which is an Excel sheet, which you may find at the hyperlink below. And so, upon opening this sheet, we will show you what it looks like out of our presentation. While going to this hyperlink, it will download a sheet. Once downloaded, it will bring you to the guidance page, the first page of the Excel sheet. You must go to the third tab, so the Summary EF from CDM tab. You may then find your country, irrespective of where your country office is located, and then you must go to the G column, which is Operating Margin EF Average. You may then find the corresponding data here. You'll notice that these values are in tons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. Of course, as mentioned, there are lots of tricky things here in this PIIRS entry point. You must always be sure that you are in the right units. So since the data has to be input into PIIRS in the grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour format, you have thus the need to enter or convert all other information into this unit. So, such as shown in the IGES file just previously. So if your source provides you your CO2 intensity in tons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour, you must multiply it by 1,000 using the formula below. So by multiplying it by 1,000, you obtain a result in grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. Now, if your source provides you your CO2 intensity in kilograms per kilowatt hour, you must also multiply it by 1,000, which is shown here below, to get a result in grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. Only when it is in the correct unit of grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour may you input this data into PIIRS. Finally, we move on to the amount of cubic meters of gas, which would be in cubic meters, and 3, consumed during the fiscal year. So this question provides an overview of the total amount of cubic meters of gas consumed by your office. For example, for heating and cooking if there's a kitchen in the office. Gas consumption can correspond to different types of gases, of course, which can be natural gas, propane, butane, or liquefied petroleum gas, which is LPG. Now, the total amount of cubic meters of gas used by your office during the fiscal year should be available in the metered gas consumption or utility bills, specifying consumption in cubic meter units. Now, gas is usually always reported in cubic meters. However, if it is not, you must convert your value into cubic meters. Showing a few conversion possibilities here. So if your gas is reported in kilowatt hours, you must divide the value by 11.36 to get a value in cubic meters. If your gas consumption is reported in cubic feet, you must multiply the value by 0.0283 to get a value in cubic meters. And finally, if your gas consumption is reported in British thermal units, or BTUs, you must multiply the value by 2.817 to the power of 10 minus 5 to get a value in cubic meters. Of course, these are just examples and usually coordinated to have these calculations for natural gas. They may differ slightly, but you can always check and use an online gas unit converter. One good one to be used is unit-converter.gasunit.nl, where you should select the corresponding gross calorific value, the GCV, of 40 megajoules per cubic meter, which is an average for most gases, but most likely correlated to natural gas. We then move to an example to illustrate the filling in of this quite complicated section on the PIIRS set, the new PIIRS Climate Smart Indicator. So let's see. Let's say your office has to report its energy consumption for fiscal year 2018. The financial department gives you some information. The electricity meter has shown that 1.2 megawatt hours has been consumed in fiscal year 2018, while the gas meter has shown that 56 cubic meters of gas were consumed. On top of this, due to some shortages during the year, 300 liters of diesel have been consumed by the generator, but the generator is shared within the building with many offices, providing thus energy to other offices as well. So first, we see that the electricity is 1.2 megawatt hours for fiscal year 2018. This is quite straightforward, and we have to convert this into kilowatt hours. So knowing that 1 megawatt hours is 1,000 kilowatt hours, we thus multiply it. We multiply 1.2 megawatt hours by 1,000. This gives us 1,200 kilowatt hours. So thus 1,200 kilowatt hours will be input into PIIRS. We then notice that 56 cubic meters of gas is reported. So this is in the correct units and can be directly put into PIIRS. We now have a PIIRS file sheet. It may look like, like that.
Yeah.
So it will look like this at the moment. We then move on to identifying the CO2 intensity of your electricity provider in grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour, in grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. Here, Excuse us, there's a slight issue with our PowerPoint, but you can read it here. So for some reason, it's not showing when we're in presentation mode. But we'll come back to that mode right afterwards. But here's to help you follow with the explanation. So say your electricity bill does not show this information, and upon calling your electricity provider, they are unable to provide you with this information. You must then use the IGES Excel file, which we will now show you. So say, let's assume that your office is in Guatemala. And upon reading the values, so first we go to the third tab, Summary EF and CDM. We go down, we find Guatemala. And upon reading the value in column G, which is the operating margin EF average, we find that the average CO2 intensity for the electricity grid in Guatemala is 0.771 tons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. We must thus convert this value into grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. So upon converting this value, so 0.771 times 1,000, we get 771 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. And that will be thus the CO2 intensity of your electricity provider to input into PIIRS, which gets input here as shown between the two other values. We then proceed to the generator usage. So regarding the generator usage, 300 liters of diesel have been consumed. However, this is the total for the whole facility and not just your office. You must identify how much of this total refers to your office. So you must use the following formula. And say the office size is 400 square meters, while the whole facility size is 1,600 square meters. Thus, using the formula, we have 400 divided by 1,600, and that is our prime surface factor, multiplied by 300 liters of diesel consumed. This is equal to 75 liters of diesel consumed due to generator use. And this thus fills out the table because we have 0 amount of gasoline and 0 liters of other fuels. So now we have a filled out table of the office energy consumption during the fiscal year, which looks as like this. We now move on to step 4. So the final step, the measures your office has taken to reduce and/or offset emissions in the fiscal year. This section allows for an assessment of the measures your office has taken to reduce and/or offset emissions in the fiscal year. It also allows to assess experience, receive feedback, and innovate towards new and better solutions. Taking a closer look, step 4.1 is the first question in this section. It'll be the awareness raising among staff about the climate change impact of each category, so flight travel, vehicle use, and office energy consumption. So you may select yes if your office implements measures to create or raise awareness among staff on the impact of their behavior on the climate. These can be elements such as setting up green teams within the office, sensitization training, introducing a code of conduct in the office, producing environmental reports, or even internal campaigning on the impact of flight emissions. Secondly, we look at the application of alternatives or measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from each category. So here you may select yes if your office implemented measures that influence, for example, for the first category, flight travel behavior to become less impactful on the climate. So some examples here would be having checklists for staff to consider before deciding to use flights, having stricter travel authorizations, the promotion of the use of trains, buses, boats, or other vehicles instead of planes, or the creation of virtual spaces for meetings instead of flight travel. For the second category, you may select yes if your office implements measures that influence vehicle travel behavior to become less impactful on the climate, such as promotion of public transport, the promotion of using car sharing or carpooling, or even bicycle use, or even again the creation of virtual spaces for meetings instead of having to use vehicles. And lastly, you may select yes if your office implements measures that influence office energy consumption behavior to become less impactful on the climate. Here you may have examples such as installing more energy efficient lighting in the office, energy efficient equipment, or even motion sensors. You can set the office equipment and HVAC, which is the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, into energy-saving modes or completely shut them down, especially during off hours. You may produce or purchase renewable energy to power the office, or promote simply paperless offices and reduce printing of reports and emails. We then move to step 3, which is the application of reduction targets for each category. Here, you may select yes if your office has set long or short-term targets to reduce emissions. Now, the reduction target should refer to a baseline year and should strive to reduce emissions in comparison to that year and by a certain percentage. For example, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 10 or 20% by or in year X, which could be a year after year 0. Also, these reductions should be overall, or absolute reductions, meaning that the absolute amount in tons of CO2 equivalent should be reduced, independent of increases in staff or in operations. We then move to step 4.4, the application of a carbon budget for each category. So you may select yes if your office applies a carbon budget to reduce emissions. Now, a carbon budget can be office-wide as well as can be individual-specific, with different carbon budgets depending on an individual's role within the organization. The intention of a carbon budget should be to limit an office's emissions. It should decrease year to year in order to drive more carbon reduction achievements. Staff are then being issued carbon budgets which they can manage at their discretion. The decision on whether or not to undertake a particular trip becomes a trade-off against their future allocation for the year. Management will receive reports of carbon expenditure against budget. It can analyze variances and ensure that departments stay within the carbon budget. Then we have 4.5. So here we look into the offset of emissions through internal funds or external parties for each category. Because here you may select yes if your office compensates for the unavoidable or residual emissions. Of course, even though reducing emissions is the best way to limit on carbon footprint, it is important to take responsibility for the emissions care offices produce. Using credible carbon offsets from known projects that have a high social impact and environmental integrity is better than doing nothing at all. Compensating for emissions can either be done through an internal fund or external parties. In both processes, some aspects must be taken into consideration for offsetting your office emissions. If you're looking at external parties, for example, gold standard offsets, which you'll find here at www.goldstandard.org, they have a good and strict requirements for sustainability, local participation, and proof that the project is truly additional to business as usual. Also, you have retiring offsets, which correspond to removing carbon credits from markets where there's a finite supply of permits to pollute. And this is notably shown in the EU. And you can find the links which are in the presentation in the notes, which is sandbag.org.uk-carbon, or even carbonretirement.com. Your office should also take into account the fact that land-based offsets, such as tree planting, might not always be the best option, as they are by their nature temporary, such as trees die in time, emitting the carbon they have absorbed back into the atmosphere. Another option is to look into internal funds. So it has been proposed that CARE sets up an internal project for offsetting, and several offices already do this. Currently, the CCRP is working on this, and you will receive more information in time through the CCRP quarterly newsletter. This CARE project should be prioritized for offsetting your office emissions once it is in place. That's it for offsetting. We now go to 4.6, which are the other measures. Of course, because there may be other measures that your office is implementing in order to reduce its carbon footprint. If that is the case, here you may describe, well, here in this case, in this entry point, any other initiative taken in order to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. We then move on to some recommendations. So as shown throughout the presentation, it is highly recommended to fill in forms regularly to avoid a number crunching exercise once a year. So as said before, using a continuous basis, so a live spreadsheet or database, rather than calculating in one exercise. So of course, not only does this make the task more manageable, but it also keeps the topic alive and increases staff's awareness on the matter. Another recommendation is to introduce a travel form that keeps track of CO2 emissions as soon as flights are booked or taken, and also to change your electricity or gas provider for cleaner ones. These are options that have been taken to use energy providers that may provide you energy with renewable and clean, sustainable energy. Another reminder is that there is, along with this PowerPoint that will be shared, as well as a recording of this PowerPoint, of this webinar, that will be made available to all. A guidance note has also been made to help you and guide you through these new PIIRS Climate Smart section indicators. And the material, again, is available at the link shown here in this PowerPoint. So I would like to thank you all for your time. If you have any feedback on this webinar, on reporting CARE's carbon footprint and climate smart practices in the guidance note and or the climate smart indicators, please contact Martina Luskova at luskova@carenederland.org. And now we are open for a session for questions.
So please, if you have any questions, you could ask us directly, or you are more than welcome to write it in a chat box. We have here the first question, which is here from Vinopavan. How about applicate on filling the data? What do you mean with that? Could you please precise your question?
Yes, is also required to fill these carbon emission section. That was my question.
Can you please maybe precise what, in more details, what is your question? Okay, thank you. We see it here.
I would see it, well, this depends on the organizational level, because since Chrysalis is working with CARE Sri Lanka, I think CARE Sri Lanka should be in charge, but if they function as well with them, then if they have all the data, if they are responsible for the usage for CARE programs or projects, they should fill in the data as well. And then this specifically, yes, the CO2 question section. But as we said in the beginning of the presentation, although this new PIIRS section is being integrated this year, CARE country offices may not have the data ready and are not obligated to fill it in this year. But if this is the case, you may take this year to officially organize yourselves and put the collection systems in place to collect the data and be ready for next year's PIIRS filling in of data.
Yeah, so we encourage you indeed to fill it in. Nevertheless, at this moment, it's not obligatory for country offices, but it will be very useful for you for the future, near future. So we have here, we cannot. So we have here another question. Lindgren, you would like to ask us?
Hi.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, yes, thank you. I have one concern and maybe two questions. Sorry. I just need to turn off the phone. Yeah, first, thank you very much for presenting this. I think that it's a quite a comprehensive approach for climate smart office. I'm a bit, for first is a concern is it sounds like it will take time for preparing, for data recording with the spreadsheet calculation. So yeah, let's see if how it worked in practice for monitoring of all these vehicle flights, calculations, things like that. I have two questions because one of the I think one of the question is about if we have any target to reduce emission, and I think that in order to reduce emission, it depends on also other factors. For example, the size of the staff this year, next year may be different. Size of projects, number of projects this year, next year for a country office may be different. And that also, determine the travel as well. So I think that we can have emission reduction compared with with what the stable situation of the office, or the a changing situation for the office. Number two, can you please also explain a little bit about CARE's own project for offsetting? I'm not clear about that one. How can we have that kind of project? Is it CARE International, or is it the project created by country office? Yeah, so I have two questions and one concern. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for both questions. So first of all, indeed, regarding your first question, that the emission as well depends on the size of and the number of the staff in an office. Indeed, we are aware of that, and this can be captured based on a calculation that we will divide the final emissions per number of staff. And this we are actually planning to do, or we would like to do that in the analysis. So this would be our approach, and we will have finally at the end of the analysis as well per the emissions per person, per staff. And we would like to as well see in the future, based on the analysis 1 year from another year, how per office, per specific office, if that specific office is decreasing the emissions. So we are not only compare the offices among each other, because indeed there can be different contexts, different situations, but at the same moment we will really look at the same office, how it's doing within the years. And for the second question, Pierre, you would like to answer?
Yes, so for the second question on your the internal projects that CARE has for offsetting, well, some offices have already set them up, and ideally, so as I said, it should be prioritized over the external parties. And so by using an internal fund, an example is that, so instead of offsetting through an external party, some offices have set up an internal fund on which a price, so once upon calculating their greenhouse gas emissions, they have taken a market-driven price, say, for example, $30 per ton of CO2. And so thus, having calculated their emissions, they set up a fund on which they correspond the amount of investment into that fund. They put it into that fund, which may then be used to help reduce CARE's emission, or be used on specific projects which are organized between different CARE offices, and to help reduce CARE CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions. And ideally, this is going to be more developed further with more and more offices joining, and the CCRP will keep you informed about this internal fund project. I hope this answers your question. Please let us know.
I can see here in the chat box that our answer regarding the country offices and filling PIIRS data on climate smart indicators was not possible to hear us because of the technical issues. So I would like to just repeat the answer that at this moment, this year, the country offices are not obliged to fill in the data on climate smart indicators. Nevertheless, we encourage you to fill it in the data, because in the future it will be very useful and helpful when the data will be required from you. And indeed, it's CARES nowadays the vision and as well mission to be climate smart. So as well, from your own motivation, we would like to encourage you. We have here another question.
By Alexander.
I did not catch the part about flights. When you calculate flights, do you count transits as a separate flight? And I assume flight time is the actual time in the air, not including the transit time.
Okay. So of course, yeah, you do not include the transit time. You calculate the time in the air and the flights. If you have a flight, well, as we said, for example, you have a flight which does have a transit flight, you will count that and as one single flight over, like, and you take the total amount of hours. However, when inputting into the calculation for atmosphere to get your greenhouse gas emissions, you have to specify that you have a transit and it's two separate flights. However, when you're counting it in the PIIRS document, you may put them down as a single flight over the amount of hours, or under, if it's two flights, under equates to under 2 hours, and they go there. However, if it's over 2 hours, what we have to specifically know is that you may count it as one flight over 2 hours. That was the prime thing to acknowledge.
So we have here another question. We have more than 1,000 number of travels, and we don't have all the itinerary details. And now it's very hard for us to track all the travel details, especially for total travel hours and departure and destination via airport. In this situation, how can we report? So what we would suggest you, I mean, at this moment, if it's not tracked, we would indeed encourage you to try to capture what you can. And at the same moment, what we as well recommend in our guidance note, that you can start, this could be one idea as well, that at this moment you will start reporting on that if you're aware of that for the future. In the guidance note, we have an example how you can start as a support, how you can start reporting on those data. So yes, I hope that I answered your question. We have here another question. It seems as time release is not in the IGS country list. From Ignace.
So in this case, of course, so if your electricity provider does not provide you with the emission intensity information, and if you do not find your country, because of course some may be missing in the IGS country list, we may then provide you, and we are constantly looking for new sources or updated sources which may have this information. If not, of course, there's a bit of research to be done. Ideally, you would have to ask your electricity provider for more information, while we will work on our side to find another type of IGS file, which includes all countries. And of course, on a regularly updated year-to-year basis.
Would you have anybody any further questions?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi everyone, this is Mira from the Philippines. So my question relates to the flights recording. With the use of the atmosphere, does it also include the domestic flights in country? So like the Philippines, we do have a lot of travels within country, and that includes also consultants and the staff of our local partners. So does the platform include that data?
Yes, yes, Mira. Thank you for your question. Yes, it does include that data. And it will, we need, of course, all domestic, all kinds of flight, whether they be domestic or international.
And to answer the second part of your question regarding the consultants, indeed, it's the consumption of the care and the consultant
Mhm.
of care.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much.
Indeed, paid by care. So it's a direct connection between the
Yeah.
care and their own.
So that would mean, like, say for example, if we engage a consultant and then they have like in-country travels or out-of-country travels that relates to their service with care, we also need to record that.
Yes, exactly. Yes, correct.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Anybody else would like to ask us something or to have some feedback or?
Hi, I just follow the question that not only consultant, if we pay for our partners for the flight, then it also need to be recorded, I assume.
If it's paid, yes. If it's paid, if you pay for your partner, I mean, the scope is out of the partners. Nevertheless, if it's paid by care, it should be included. But normally, the partners are not included in the scope of the calculations. But in the case that the care pays that specific flight or a vehicle travel for a partner, yes, it should be included.
Thank you.
We have one question here. Let's see, what is the question here?
So here I couldn't hear the answer to this question due to some connection issues. Can you please repeat the answer? Sorry for, yeah, I did not catch the part about flights. When you calculate flights, do you count transits as a separate flights? And I assume flight time is the actual time in the air, not including transit time.
Yes, so the flight time will be the actual time in the air and not including transit time. So if you wait 6 hours in an airport, that does not count for the total flight time. You must take the actual flight time of each separate flight. Now, if you calculate flights, if you count transits as separate flights, well, you will count, well, if you have a single flight when you have to register and you have a transit in a separate airport, you will count it because, of course, in the PIIRS system, we distinguish between flights which are under or equal to 2 hours and those flights which are over 2 hours. This is to be able to get an idea of what care offices and what type of flights they are taking, whether long distance or relative short distance. So in this kind of input, you will have to count flights with separate, with a transit as a single flight, just from departure to destination. However, when calculating your greenhouse gas emissions, to be as precise as possible in our scope, if, for example, you use atmosphere.de, you will then have to consider, of course, your transit stop, since a lot of emissions a lot of them can be due to takeoff and landing. A lot of energy use is used during those two steps. And so by using an online calculator, you have to, of course, consider them as separate flights in a way by using a transit airport. I hope this answers the question. Thank you.
So as we are coming to the end of our webinar and as well the time, unfortunately. So if you have any last questions, now is the moment. So if there is no other questions, I would like to just mention for you that this webinar has been recorded. So we will share with you the link along with this webinar recorded. We will share, and it's already as well online, the document questions and answers. At the same moment, we will share with you in this link the guidance note that you can go through and the presentation of this webinar. So thank you very much for your time, for attending, for questions and discussions. Thank you as well very much to Pierre that he presented this presentation, and looking forward to your other feedbacks or observations.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.